The autumn wind rustled through the trees as Marcus walked home from his school's robotics club. The golden medal from the science competition swayed gently against his chest with each step. He had won first place for his robot that could help people with disabilities pick up things from the floor. The design wasn't perfect yet, but his teachers said it showed great promise. At 12 years old, Marcus was already known in his school as the young inventor. His backpack was heavy with books about engineering and computer coding, but he didn't mind the weight. These books were his tickets to the future he dreamed about. As he approached the busy intersection of Oak Street and Main Avenue, something caught his eye. An elderly woman stood at the corner, struggling with 3 bags of groceries. The traffic light had changed 4 times, but she hadn't moved. The bags looked too heavy for her thin arms, and she kept looking at the fast-moving cars with worried eyes. Marcus remembered what his grandmother always told him. Kindness doesn't cost anything, but it can mean everything to someone who needs it. Without hesitation, he walked over to the woman. "Excuse me, ma'am," Marcus said politely, adjusting his school backpack. "Would you like some help crossing the street?" The elderly woman looked at him, surprise turning into a warm smile that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. She wore a simple blue dress and a white cardigan, both neat but a bit worn. "Oh dear, that's very kind of you. These old legs aren't what they used to be, and these bags are quite heavy. I can carry those for you," Marcus offered, already reaching for the heaviest bags. "My mom always buys lots of groceries too. I'm used to helping her carry them." The woman handed him 2 of the bags, keeping the lightest one for herself. "Such a gentleman," she said. "You remind me of my grandson. He's in college now, studying to be a doctor." As they waited for the walk signal, Marcus noticed his science medal had slipped out from under his jacket. The elderly woman spotted it too. "My, what's that lovely medal for?" she asked. Marcus felt his face warm with pride. "I won it today at the science fair. I made a robot that can help people pick things up when they can't bend down easily." The walk signal turned white, and Marcus carefully guided the woman across the street. He made sure to walk at her pace, watching for any cars that might not stop completely. "A robot? How wonderful!" she exclaimed. "When I was young, we could only dream of such things. Now tell me more about this invention of yours." As they walked, Marcus explained his project with growing excitement. He told her about the sensors that could detect objects, the mechanical arm he designed, and how he programmed it all by himself. The woman listened with genuine interest, asking clever questions that showed she understood more than most adults he talked to. "My grandmother has trouble bending down to pick up things she drops," Marcus explained. "That's what gave me the idea. The robot uses a camera to see things on the floor and has a gentle grabber that won't break anything fragile." They were so deep in conversation that they almost didn't notice they had reached the woman's house, a small but well-kept place with flower pots on the porch. "This is my stop," she said. "I'm Mrs. Thompson, by the way. Would you mind helping me get these bags up to the porch?" "Of course not, Mrs. Thompson," Marcus replied cheerfully. "I'm Marcus." As he carried the bags up the porch steps, neither of them noticed the expensive car that had followed them slowly from the intersection. Nor did they see the driver watching them with suspicious eyes, already reaching for his phone to make a call that would turn this simple act of kindness into something much more complicated. For now, though, Marcus was just happy to help. As he arranged the grocery bags carefully on the porch, Mrs. Thompson's kind smile reminded him exactly why his grandmother's words about kindness were always true. Mr. Rogers sat in his shiny black car, his fingers drumming against the leather steering wheel. He had been having a bad day already. His coffee was cold this morning. His business meeting got canceled. And now this. He watched as the young black boy helped Mrs. Thompson with her groceries, but in his mind, something had to be wrong with this picture. This neighborhood used to be different, he muttered to himself, pulling out his expensive phone. His fingers shook slightly as he dialed 911. Meanwhile, Marcus was showing Mrs. Thompson his robot design sketches. He had pulled out his notebook, and they sat on her porch steps while he explained his ideas. The afternoon sun made his science fair metal shine brightly. "See, the arm can rotate this way," Marcus said, drawing a quick diagram. "That means it can pick up things from under furniture too." Mrs. Thompson nodded, genuinely impressed. "You've thought this through very carefully. When I was your age, we didn't even have computers in our homes. Now look at you, building robots." Inside his car, Mr. Rogers spoke quietly, but urgently into his phone. "Yes, I need to report suspicious activity. There's a young male. Yes, he's following an elderly woman to her house, corner of Oak Street and Pine Road. No, I don't know them personally, but something doesn't look right." The dispatcher's voice crackled through his phone. "Sir, can you describe what exactly makes this suspicious?" "He just appeared out of nowhere and followed her home," Mr. Rogers said, leaving out the part where he had watched Marcus help her cross the street. Better safe than sorry, right? On the porch, Mrs. Thompson had gone inside to get Marcus a glass of lemonade to thank him for his help. The cold drink tasted perfect after carrying the heavy bags. "My grandson would love to see your robot designs," Mrs. Thompson said, sitting in her porch chair. "He's studying medicine now, but he always had a knack for technology too. Do you know what you want to study when you grow up?" Marcus's eyes lit up. "I want to work for NASA. Or maybe start my own company making robots to help people. My dad says I should dream big." "Those are wonderful dreams," Mrs. Thompson replied, smiling. "You remind me of—" Before she could finish her sentence, the sound of sirens cut through the peaceful afternoon. 2 police cars pulled up in front of the house, their lights flashing. Mr. Rogers stepped out of his car, pointing toward the porch. Marcus felt his heart start beating faster. He had seen enough news stories to know that sometimes people made wrong assumptions about kids who looked like him. His father had talked to him about staying calm in situations like this. Mrs. Thompson stood up slowly, her kind face turning serious. "Young man, you stay right here with me," she said firmly, her voice carrying a strength that hadn't been there before. 2 police officers approached the porch while Mr. Rogers stayed by his car, arms crossed. Marcus noticed his hands were shaking slightly, but he remembered what his parents had taught him. Stay polite, stay calm, and tell the truth. "Good afternoon, officers." Mrs. Thompson spoke first, her voice clear and confident. "Is there something wrong?" One of the officers looked between Marcus and Mrs. Thompson. "We received a call about suspicious activity. Ma'am, do you know this young man?" Mrs. Thompson's voice turned sharp as winter ice. "Know him? This brilliant young gentleman just helped me carry my groceries home and was showing me his award-winning science project. Would you like to see his medal?" The second officer glanced at Marcus's science fair medal, then at the robot designs spread out on the porch steps. Something in the officer's expression changed as he began to understand the situation. Mr. Rogers stood by his car, his certainty beginning to crack as he watched the scene unfold. He hadn't expected this elderly woman to speak up so forcefully, and he certainly hadn't expected to see engineering drawings and a science medal. The afternoon sun continued to shine, indifferent to the drama below, as a simple act of kindness was about to reveal much more than anyone expected. The afternoon had turned tense on Mrs. Thompson's porch. The police officers stood at the bottom of the steps, looking increasingly uncomfortable as they began to understand the situation. Marcus sat quietly, his robot designs still spread out on the steps beside him, while Mrs. Thompson stood like a shield between him and everyone else. Mr. Rogers walked up from his car, his expensive shoes clicking against the sidewalk. "Officers, I still think we should check this out properly. You never know these days." Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Check what out, exactly?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of years of wisdom and authority. "Would you like to explain why you called the police on a child who was helping an old woman with her groceries?" The first officer, whose name tag read Wilson, took out his notepad. "Ma'am, could you tell us exactly what happened?" "Gladly," Mrs. Thompson replied. She stood straighter, her small frame somehow filling the whole porch. I was struggling with my groceries at the intersection. This young gentleman, Marcus, offered to help me cross the street and carry my bags. He then showed me his impressive robotics project, for which he won first place at his school's science fair today. Officer Wilson's partner looked at the robot designs on the steps. "These are pretty impressive," he said, picking up one of the drawings. "You made these yourself, son?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir. It's a robot to help people pick up things when they have trouble bending down, like elderly people or people with disabilities." Mr. Rogers shifted uncomfortably. "What I saw him following you." His voice trailed off as Mrs. Thompson turned her full attention to him. "Following me?" Mrs. Thompson's voice could have frozen a summer day. "Young man, do you often spy on elderly women and their helpers? Do you always assume the worst when you see a black child being kind?" The police officers exchanged glances. Officer Wilson put away his notepad. "Mr. Rogers, making false reports is a serious matter." "I wasn't. I didn't." Mr. Rogers stuttered, his face turning red. "I was trying to help." "Help?" Mrs. Thompson's voice rose slightly. "Let me tell you about help. Help is what this young man offered when he saw me struggling. Help is carrying heavy bags for a stranger, and then sharing his dreams of becoming an engineer. That's help, Mr. Rogers." Just then, a sleek military vehicle pulled up to the curb. A tall man in an Air Force colonel's uniform stepped out, his face concerned but composed. Marcus stood up straighter. "Dad," he said quietly. Colonel James walked up to the group, his presence commanding immediate respect. The police officers instinctively stood at attention. "I got a call from a neighbor," Colonel James said calmly. "Would someone like to explain why there are police cars outside this house, and why my son, who is supposed to be walking home from his robotics club, is being questioned?" Mr. Rogers seemed to shrink several inches. The expensive watch on his wrist suddenly felt very heavy. "Colonel James," Officer Wilson said, "there seems to have been a misunderstanding. Your son was helping Mrs. Thompson with her groceries, and someone," he glanced at Mr. Rogers, "misinterpreted the situation." Mrs. Thompson smiled warmly at Colonel James. "Your son is a credit to you, Colonel. He helped me home and showed me his wonderful invention. Did you know he won first place in the science fair today?" The colonel's stern expression softened with pride. "Yes, ma'am. He worked very hard on that project." Mr. Rogers looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. The situation had spiraled far beyond what he had imagined when he made that phone call. The second officer turned to Mr. Rogers. "Sir, we'll need you to come down to the station to file a statement about this false report." The afternoon sun was starting to cast long shadows across the porch. What had started as a simple act of kindness had turned into something much bigger. A lesson about assumptions, prejudice, and the power of standing up for what's right. Mrs. Thompson looked at Marcus with a twinkle in her eye. "Now, young man, before all these interruptions, you were telling me more about your robot design." The tension in front of Mrs. Thompson's house began to fade as the truth of the situation became clear. Mr. Rogers stood awkwardly between the police officers, his earlier confidence completely gone. Colonel James had moved to stand near his son, one hand resting proudly on Marcus's shoulder. Mrs. Thompson cleared her throat. "Since we're all here, perhaps I should properly introduce myself." She turned to look directly at Mr. Rogers. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Thompson, retired lead engineer from NASA's robotics division. I spent 30 years designing systems for the space program." The silence that followed was complete. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping for a moment. Marcus's eyes grew wide. You worked for NASA?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. Dr. Thompson smiled. "Indeed I did. That's why I was so interested in your robot design. The grip mechanism you created reminds me of something we developed for the Mars rovers." She picked up one of Marcus's drawings from the porch steps. "See this part here? We used a similar system to help the rovers pick up rock samples." Mr. Rogers had turned pale. He looked like a man who had just realized he had not only dug himself into a hole, but had somehow managed to dig straight through to the other side of the earth. Colonel James looked at Dr. Thompson with new understanding. Dr. Thompson, Eleanor Thompson, were you involved in the Pathfinder mission? I was the one who designed the sample collection system, she said modestly, though that was quite a while ago. These days, I mostly tend to my garden and keep up with scientific journals. She winked at Marcus, and apparently meet young geniuses who help me with my groceries. Officer Wilson had put away his notebook and was shaking his head slightly. Dr. Thompson, I apologize for this disturbance. We should have asked more questions before responding to the call. Don't apologize, Dr. Thompson said firmly. You came to check on the safety of an elderly woman. That's your job. The problem isn't with you. She looked pointedly at Mr. Rogers. The problem is with people who see a young black boy being kind and assume he must be up to no good. Marcus had been quiet, taking everything in, but now he spoke up. Dr. Thompson, would you maybe look at my other designs sometime? I have more ideas, but I'm not sure if they would work. I'd be delighted, Dr. Thompson replied. In fact, she walked to her front door and came back with a thick book. This is a textbook on robotics engineering that I helped write. Would you like to borrow it? Marcus accepted the book carefully, as if it were made of gold. His fingers traced the NASA logo on its cover. Mr. Rogers finally found his voice. Dr. Thompson, I don't know what to say. I made a terrible assumption. Yes, you did, Dr. Thompson replied calmly. But what matters now is what you learned from this. That young man there, she pointed to Marcus, didn't see an old white woman when he offered to help me. He saw someone who needed help. Perhaps you could learn from his example. Colonel James looked at the police officers. I trust this situation is resolved. Yes, sir, Officer Wilson replied, though we will need Mr. Rogers to come to the station regarding the false report. As the group began to disperse, Dr. Thompson turned to Marcus one last time. Come by tomorrow after school if you'd like. Bring your designs. I may be retired, but I still know a thing or two about robots. Marcus hugged the robotics book to his chest, his science fair medal glinting in the late afternoon sun. What had started as a simple act of kindness had turned into something he could never have imagined. A chance to learn from someone who had helped send robots to Mars. Sometimes, he realized, the best opportunities come from simply doing the right thing. The next morning, the local police station was quiet except for the soft hum of computers and the occasional ring of phones. Mr. Rogers sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, filling out paperwork about his false report. His expensive suit looked out of place in the simple surroundings. Officer Wilson walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Mr. Rogers. You know, he said, sitting down, in my 15 years on the force, this is one of the more interesting cases I've handled. Mr. Rogers stared into his coffee cup. I made a terrible mistake, he said quietly. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment. Yes, you did, Officer Wilson agreed. But do you know what the real twist is? He pulled out a newspaper and placed it on the desk. Take a look at today's front page. Mr. Rogers picked up the paper, and his eyes widened. There was a large photograph of Colonel James receiving a military honor last month. The headline read, Local Hero, Air Force Colonel James leads breakthrough in military medical technology. Marcus's father, Officer Wilson explained, isn't just any military officer. He leads a team developing new medical devices to help wounded veterans. And according to this article, his interest in medical technology started because his son was always inventing things to help people. Mr. Rogers put down his coffee cup with a shaking hand. I had no idea. That's exactly the point, Officer Wilson said. You saw what you expected to see, not what was actually there. A kid with a science medal, helping an elderly woman who turned out to be a NASA engineer, and his father is a military hero working on medical technology. You missed all of that because you couldn't see past your own assumptions. Just then, The police station door opened. Dr. Thompson walked in, looking much more formal than she had the day before. She wore a NASA pin on her jacket lapel. "Ah, Mr. Rogers," she said, walking over to their table. "I thought I might find you here. I came to sign my statement about yesterday's events." Mr. Rogers stood up quickly, almost knocking over his coffee. "Dr. Thompson, I want to apologize again. I've been thinking about what you said." "Good," she interrupted, "because I have a proposal for you." She sat down at the table. "I'm on the board of the city's Science Education Foundation. We're always looking for sponsors for young inventors like Marcus, people who can help provide resources for children who might not otherwise have them." Mr. Rogers blinked in surprise. "Are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting you put your money and influence to better use," Dr. Thompson said firmly. "Instead of making assumptions about young black children, help them achieve their dreams. The foundation has a program specifically focused on supporting minority students in STEM fields." Officer Wilson smiled. "That sounds like a much better use of your time than filling out false report paperwork." Mr. Rogers looked at the newspaper again, at the photo of Colonel James, then thought about Marcus's careful robot designs. How much does the foundation need?" "Well," Dr. Thompson said, pulling out some papers from her bag, "Marcus isn't the only young inventor in our community. We have 25 students who could use sponsorship for their science projects this year. Some of them might even end up working for NASA one day." She smiled. "Or maybe they'll create something to help people, like Marcus is doing." Mr. Rogers took the papers with trembling hands. As he read through them, his face changed. The arrogance from yesterday was gone, replaced by something that looked like understanding. "I'll sponsor all of them," he said quietly. "And I'd like to learn more about their projects, if that's possible." Dr. Thompson's smile widened. "Well, as it happens, we're having a student showcase next week. Marcus will be presenting his robot design. Would you like to come and see what these young scientists are capable of when people believe in them instead of doubting them?" Mr. Rogers nodded, and for the first time since yesterday, he smiled too. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest mistakes could lead to the most important changes. 1 week after the incident, the city's community center was buzzing with excitement. The Science Education Foundation's student showcase had drawn a bigger crowd than ever before. Bright posters and interesting projects filled the main hall, but the biggest crowd gathered around a table in the center. Marcus stood proudly next to his improved robot design. After a week of working with Dr. Thompson, his invention had become something truly special. The robot arm moved smoothly as it demonstrated picking up various objects from the floor, placing them gently on a table. The grip sensors, Marcus explained to the amazed audience, can tell how fragile something is, so it knows exactly how much pressure to use. He placed a raw egg in front of the robot. The mechanical arm carefully lifted it and set it down without even a crack. Dr. Thompson stood nearby, beaming with pride. She had spent every afternoon that week working with Marcus, sharing her knowledge and experience. On the table next to the robot sat her old NASA badge, which she had brought to inspire the young scientists. Colonel James watched from the side, recording everything on his phone. "My son," he told another parent, "always wanted to help people, but meeting Dr. Thompson, that changed everything." The crowd parted as Mr. Rogers walked in, looking very different from the angry man of a week ago. He carried a large box, and his usual business suit had been replaced by a casual shirt with the Science Foundation's logo. "Marcus," he called out, "I brought something that might help with your project." He opened the box to reveal a set of advanced sensors. "These are used in medical devices. I thought maybe you could use them to make your robot even better at helping people." Marcus's eyes lit up. "These are perfect for the nursing home version I'm working on." He looked at his father. "Can I show Mr. Rogers the new designs?" Colonel James nodded, smiling. The change in Mr. Rogers over the past week had been remarkable. After sponsoring the student programs, he had thrown himself into learning about each project, especially Marcus. Nearby, Officer Wilson watched the scene with satisfaction. He had come off duty to see the showcase, and he wore a small robot pin that Marcus had given him as a thank you for handling that difficult day so well. Amazing what can happen when people actually talk to each other, isn't it? Dr. Thompson said, walking up beside him. Yes, ma'am, Officer Wilson replied. Though I have to admit, I didn't expect Mr. Rogers to change so completely. Dr. Thompson chuckled. Sometimes people just need a wake-up call. And seeing these young scientists, she gestured around the room, where other students were showing their projects. It's hard to hold on to prejudice when you see how brilliant they all are. The local news had sent a reporter who was interviewing Marcus about his invention. And what inspired you to create this robot? The reporter asked. Marcus smiled. Well, it started because I wanted to help my grandmother. But then I met Dr. Thompson when I helped her with her groceries, and everything got bigger. Now we're working on making these robots for nursing homes and hospitals. The reporter looked interested. Isn't this the same Dr. Thompson who worked at NASA? Actually, Dr. Thompson interrupted, stepping forward. The story isn't about my past at NASA. It's about this young man's future, and all these other young scientists here today. She put her hand on Marcus's shoulder. They're going to change the world, if we just give them the chance. Mr. Rogers, overhearing this, stepped forward. And that's exactly what we're going to do. The foundation is expanding its support program. Every student here will have the resources they need to develop their ideas. The reporter's camera captured the moment. Marcus demonstrating his robot, Dr. Thompson watching proudly, Mr. Rogers explaining the new support program, and Colonel James recording it all. It was a picture of what could happen when people looked past their prejudices and saw the potential in each other. In the background, Marcus's robot gently picked up another egg, showing that sometimes the most delicate things could be handled with just the right touch. 1 year had passed since that fateful afternoon, when Marcus helped an elderly woman with her groceries. The local convention center was packed with people attending the National Young Inventors Competition. Bright lights shone down on rows of amazing projects, but everyone was talking about the display in the center. Marcus, now 13, stood confidently beside his newest invention. It wasn't just one robot anymore. It was a whole family of helper robots. Each one was designed for a different purpose. One for hospitals, one for nursing homes, and one specially made for people's homes. The best part, Marcus explained to the judges, is that they can all talk to each other. If one robot learns something new about helping people, it shares that information with all the other robots in the network. Dr. Thompson sat in the front row, her NASA pin gleaming on her jacket. Over the past year, she had become more than just a mentor to Marcus. She was like a second grandmother. Every Tuesday and Thursday they worked together in her garage, which she had turned into a small robotics lab. Watch this, Marcus said to the judges. He demonstrated how the hospital robot could carefully lift a patient's arm for therapy exercises, while the home robot showed how it could pick up dropped medicine bottles and bring them to people who had trouble walking. In the audience, Mr. Rogers watched with pride. He wasn't the same man who had made that prejudiced phone call a year ago. Now he was the head of the city's Science Education Foundation, and he had helped set up similar programs in 3 other cities. It's amazing, he whispered to Colonel James, who sat next to him. All of this because your son decided to help someone cross the street. Colonel James smiled. His military uniform was decorated with new medals, but none made him as proud as watching his son on that stage. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the biggest impact, he replied. Officer Wilson was there too, now promoted to captain. He had started a program at the police department to help officers recognize and overcome their biases. He often told the story of Marcus and Dr. Thompson as an example of why people shouldn't jump to conclusions. Marcus's robots had already been installed in 2 local nursing homes and 1 hospital. The nurses reported that elderly patients loved them, especially because the robots could bring them things they needed without them having to call for help. And now, Marcus said to the judges, we're working on making them even better. Dr. Thompson helped me design a new system that lets the robots understand simple voice commands in 12 different languages. The crowd gasped as Marcus demonstrated this feature. One robot responded to commands in English, Spanish, Chinese, and more languages, helping people no matter how they spoke. The future of helping people, Marcus explained, shouldn't be limited by language or ability. Everyone deserves to have help when they need it. As the judges huddled together to make their decision, Dr. Thompson walked up to Marcus. "Did you tell them about the space program's interest?" she asked with a twinkle in her eye. Marcus grinned. NASA had contacted them last month, interested in adapting his robot design for use on the International Space Station. They thought his gentle grit system would be perfect for handling delicate experiments in space. The head judge stepped forward with an envelope. The room went quiet. The winner of this year's National Young Inventors Competition and recipient of the Future Technology Impact Award, Marcus James. The crowd erupted in cheers. As Marcus accepted the trophy, he looked out at all the people who had helped him get there. Dr. Thompson, his father, Mr. Rogers, Captain Wilson, all people who had been brought together by one simple act of kindness. Later that evening, as they celebrated at Dr. Thompson's house, Marcus saw an elderly woman struggling with groceries across the street. Without hesitation, he went to help her, just as he had done a year ago. Because sometimes the biggest journeys start with the smallest steps, and the greatest changes begin with simple acts of kindness.